Hi, there. We're going to sort and organize sources, which is one way a course foundation can be structured into clearer sections. Once you have your sources added, one thing that you'll want to do is click F5 to refresh your notebook. And when you refresh your notebook, what you'll notice then is that NotebookLM will give you an updated summary, and you can save that summary to your studio by clicking on Save. To note, you can change the label by clicking on the source and then changing it or giving it a numbering convention. When we click on the Studio button, you'll see your studio elements here in this area. You can also rename your entire notebook. If you go to the top, you can rename your notebook or give it a numbering convention. So for example, we can go to this element. We can then give it a numbering convention, or we can change the title altogether. Once we click inside of the notebook, the title will then change. You'll notice then that the title will change here in this area. What we can also do is we can change the icon. For example, if we click on top of this icon, what we can do is we can then change the icon and we can add our icon to our notebook. So now our icon will now appear with this notebook with the updated title. And if we go to the front page, we'll now see our title here in this area. You'll also see it when you sort for the title. For a long time, we thought a course earned its place because we had knowledge and we had the nerve to record it. That was the old belief that information alone could stand in for a product line. What we learned is that a course without a named gap and a named buyer outcome is not a product. It is content with a price tag. That missing piece shows up fast because lessons start multiplying with no clear boundary. That is the moment the trace breaks because nothing in the course can be checked against closing one specific gap. That is why our end-of-year business goal, a real product line built on proven problem solving, stays out of reach when that traceable line does not exist. A strategy that exists only as "I want to teach this" fails the trace to one specific gap and one specific buyer outcome. The heart of the course stays unnamed in observable terms because the gap is not stated as a gap and the outcome is not stated as an outcome. The lesson list starts reflecting our interests instead of the single gap we said we were closing. The boundaries get soft because anything related feels allowed inside. The traceability test fails right there because no one can point to a lesson and say, "This closes the gap," without stretching. That failure matters now because a product line cannot stack when each new course has no clean reason for existing. Research that stops at "people talk about this online" does not name one specific gap and one specific buyer outcome. In a way, lessons can stay traceable. The demand question stays fuzzy, and the gap question stays unproven, so the course gets built on assumption. The market already having similar courses is not the issue. The issue is whether our course closes a gap those courses leave open. When that gap is not named precisely, the outcome cannot be named precisely either. The traceability test fails because similarity forces us into broad coverage instead of tight closure of one missing piece. That failure matters now because problem solving only becomes a product line when each product solves a defined problem on purpose. A unique angle that cannot be stated as one specific gap and one specific buyer outcome breaks traceability before recording even starts. The angle becomes personality or style instead of an observable difference in what gets solved. The course outline starts drifting into extra modules meant to prove value instead of producing the named outcome. The result looks full, but it does not look accountable to one gap. The traceability test fails because lessons cannot be tied back to closing that single missing thing in the current offerings. That failure matters now because our end-of-year target depends on repeatable problem solving, not on reinventing what makes each course special. A course built from spur-of-the-moment decisions cannot keep every lesson traceable to closing one specific gap and producing one specific buyer outcome. The planning phase gets replaced by recording energy, and energy always runs ahead of structure. The course starts collecting topics like receipts in a purse, familiar, messy, and hard to audit later. The moment we try to tighten it up, we find multiple gaps being addressed halfway instead of one gap being closed fully. The traceability test fails because no single through line can be followed from first lesson to last lesson without detours. That failure matters now because a product line needs clean lanes, not scattered side streets. A late discovery that there is no demand is usually a sign that no single gap and no single buyer outcome were named early enough to keep lessons traceable. The research got skipped or treated like optional homework, so the course got built first and questioned later. That pattern produces sunk cost pressure, which then pushes more lessons into the course to make it feel worth it. More lessons do not restore traceability when the original gap was never pinned down. The traceability test fails because the course cannot prove what it closes, only what it covers. That failure matters now because problem-solving skills only compound into a product line when each product has a verified problem it resolves. A paid launch with no prior promotion often reveals something deeper than marketing timing. It reveals weak naming of the gap and weak naming of the buyer outcome. When those two things are clear, they show up naturally in how we describe what the course does without stretching or decorating it. When those two things are unclear, spreading the word turns into vague claims that do not match any single lesson path inside the course. The traceability test fails because even we cannot point cleanly from promise to lesson to result without adding extra explanation. That failure matters now because an end-of-year product line needs offers that stand on their own structure, not offers held together by constant clarification. A course that tries to draw in new clients without anchoring on one specific gap and one specific buyer outcome loses traceability under its own ambition. Serving new people and serving existing people can both be true, but only if the same defined gap is being closed for both groups. When that shared gap is not named, lessons start splitting into beginner tracks and advanced tracks inside one paid container. The course becomes two courses fighting for space, and neither closes one gap cleanly. The traceability test fails because lessons stop pointing to one outcome and start pointing to multiple possible outcomes depending on who shows up. That failure matters now because a product line grows by stacking clean solutions, not by stuffing mixed audiences into one promise. A broader goal like digital footprint cannot hold up our end-of-year business goal unless each course earns its place by closing one specific gap with one specific buyer outcome that every lesson stays tied to. We know now that footprint language hides weak structure because it sounds like progress even when nothing is closing cleanly. We also know now that proven problem solving shows up as tight cause and effect inside the offer, not as volume of content produced over time. When every lesson can be traced back to closing that single named gap, the course becomes a stable unit we can build around again and again. When that trace breaks, every new course becomes another reinvention cycle with another set of loose ends. That is why this matters right now, because our product line only becomes real by year's end when each course holds that same observable through line from gap to outcome without drifting. When the gap and the buyer outcome are named up front, the course stops being a pile of lessons and starts reading like one clean solution. If the notebook title and icon carry that gap and outcome, and the sources are labeled to match, the summary becomes a standing checkpoint for what belongs. When a new lesson idea shows up, it can be parked against that summary and either fits or it does not. That same setup keeps each course unit tight enough to stack into a real product line based on proven problem solving. This is how we hold the line. There you have it, and I will see you in another video.